Okay, we're moving on to probably one of the most important presidents this country's ever had, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the reason the topic's called Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal is we're starting now to have presidents name their administrations, okay? And you're going to have a name for an administration for Truman, and you're going to have one for Eisenhower, and you're going to have one for Kennedy, whose probably administration is the most well-known, is called the New Frontier. But we're starting to get to name these administrations now, and Roosevelt was the first to do that. So before we start talking about what he did, remember we came out of the 20s, came out of a depression, had a lot of issues financially, and it's going to be Franklin Roosevelt's job after being elected president to get all this fixed. And he does a wonderful job. But to get elected, we have to talk about the election of 1932. 1932. Now, who's the president at this time? Anybody remember? Herbert Hoover. And he actually is nominated by the Republicans for re-election, which kind of was a surprise because he got blamed for the Depression. But obviously they didn't have a better candidate. So in the summer of 1932, the Republicans nominated President Hoover for re-election. I would state on that topic, though, 99.9999% of the time, if the incoming, or if the president, sitting president, wants to run for re-election, it happens all the time. The only time we had some pressure from this point on is when Johnson is going to run for re-election in '68. President Lyndon Johnson in the Vietnam War kind of consumed him, and he faced a challenge from people within his own party. That normally doesn't happen. So the Republicans nominated Hoover. He wanted to run for re-election. The Democrats obviously countered with Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was from New York, and the man that he chose to be his running mate, which we'll talk about when we get into the Kennedy assassination, was John Nance Garner of Texas. So in the election of 1932, Franklin Roosevelt will be the Democratic nominee, and he will pick John Nance Garner of Texas as his running mate. And we will talk about John Nance Garner on the day that Kennedy was assassinated, what small piece of trivia he had to do with that. Now, obviously, there were no chance for the Republicans here. Because of the Great Depression, Americans were looking for a new leader for the United States, and as a result, Roosevelt crushed Hoover, 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59. 472 to 59. One of the worst beatings that a sitting president seeking re-election ever took. So 472 electoral votes for Roosevelt, 59 for Hoover. Now, what does a presidential-elect really hope happens in Congress during an election year? Same party controls Congress. And Roosevelt, one of the reasons he was so successful is during the election of 1932, the Democrats won both houses of Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. So Roosevelt's going to start this big task he has of getting the nation back on sound financial footing, having the support of both houses of Congress, which will be great. And again, the reason Roosevelt, his administration came as the New Deal is he promised the American people a New Deal to pull the nation out of its problems. And that's where the name came from. So, as a virtue of the election of 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes President of the United States. John Nance Garner of Texas becomes the nation's Vice President. Okay, that'll take us then to the profile on Franklin D. Roosevelt, so you know a little bit about the guy we're talking about. Okay, interesting fellow. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882. He was born on January 30th, 1882 in Hyde Park, New York, which is on your ID sheet. So Franklin Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. And he was an only child. He was the only child of James and Sarah Roosevelt. And both James Roosevelt and his wife Sarah came from very wealthy families. The Roosevelts were quite wealthy. So Franklin, the only child, grew up in a very wealthy family. Now, his father was quite a bit older than his mother. When Franklin was born, James Roosevelt was 53, while Sarah was just 26. So she was quite young in comparison to him, which at the time wasn't that unusual. It might be a little unusual now, but at the time it was not. Now, because if they were so wealthy, how do you think Franklin Roosevelt was educated until he was 14 years old? Privately, with private tutors. Okay, he was educated privately with private tutors until he was 14 years old. So he never really went to school. He had private tutors come in and teach him until he was 14. Well, he had to go to high school, or wanted to at the age of 14, so he went to a private school in Massachusetts. So he was educated by private tutors until he was 14 years old, and then when he turned 14, he entered a private school in Massachusetts, and he did very, very well academically, but he was very, very shy and had very few close friends. Very shy and had very few close friends. So he had a very quiet, I guess, education. Now, he graduated from that private high school in Massachusetts in 1900, and guess where he went to school, Chantel? Harvard University. Went to Harvard University. And he majored in history. History. Majored in history. So, after graduating from the private high school in Massachusetts in 1900, Franklin Roosevelt enrolled at Harvard University, majoring in history. Now, he was very bright. He graduated from Harvard University in just 3 years. Just 3 years. And after his 3-year degree from Harvard University, he entered Columbia University Law School. Very, very bright. So Franklin Roosevelt graduated from Harvard University in just 3 years, and then entered Columbia University Law School. Well, you might as well hear this. Poor old Kylie's even going to get a bigger weird on her face. During that time, Franklin began to court his distant cousin, Eleanor. And the couple became engaged in 1903. So Franklin began to court his distant cousin, Eleanor. He actually did that at Harvard when he was there. But they became engaged in 1903. And Franklin Roosevelt had kind of a weird upbringing. When Franklin told his mother that he was going to marry Eleanor, and it didn't matter to his mother even that it was a distant cousin, she was very, very unhappy. She was so possessive. He was an only child. She did not want another woman in Franklin's life. And so she was very, very unhappy when Franklin told his mother of his plans to marry, because she was very possessive of her only son and really was unhappy at the engagement. Matter of fact, she tried so hard to change his mind about the marriage that he took her on a Caribbean cruise, hoping he would forget Eleanor and decide not to marry her. So she did everything she could to try to convince him that this wasn't the thing to do. Oh, you really, boys, especially girls, you don't want this. So, didn't work. Eleanor and Franklin were married, and when they went on their honeymoon, Franklin's mother took it upon herself to rent a house for the newlyweds and furnished it with her taste of furniture. Now, if you were the bride, would you just be going, holy, what have I got myself into here? So she actually, without really consulting them, rented a house that she wanted them to have and furnished it completely to her taste. Well, Eleanor had two choices. She could revolt and anger her mother-in-law, or she could just accept the arrangement. What do you think she did? Just accepted the arrangement. Now, during their marriage, Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt had 6 children. There wasn't any complications. It was a very distant relationship. They had 5 boys and 1 girl during their marriage. 5 boys and 1 girl. Now, their firstborn was Franklin Delano Jr., and he actually died in his infancy in 1909. So they lost him quickly. So the first child was lost, Franklin Delano Jr. He died in infancy in 1909. And I'll tell you what, the kids lived a long time. Some died, one died in the 70s, one died in the 80s, one died in the 90s, or two, I can't remember. And the last one, James Roosevelt, died in 1991. So his children lived pretty long lives, okay? But they did have 6 children. One died shortly in infancy. Well, why would Franklin Roosevelt go to Columbia University School of Law? Become a lawyer, but actually he passed his bar examination in 1907, but he really didn't have any interest in the study of law, so he left Columbia University before he even received his degree. He passed the bar examination, which you can take, and he had a little interest in the study of law, so he actually left the university before he got his law degree. And he went into politics. Very good, went into politics. Very successful. 1910, he was just 29 years old and was elected to the United States Senate at the age of 29. So in 1910, Franklin Roosevelt was elected to the United States Senate at the age of 29. Now, do you remember who President Wilson ran against in the 1912 presidential election? Think about what we're talking about here. Who did he run against? We're talking about Franklin Roosevelt, so who do you think he ran against? Remember your notes there. Ran against Teddy Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt actually supported Wilson over his cousin, Theodore, in the election of 1912.
Those two, were they first cousins?
I believe so. And they weren't real close. Now, why would he do that? Why would he do that? Maybe he believed that Wilson would be a better president, but what do you think?
No, I don't know. This is a guess.
Well, you
But
probably
what
should.
if he wanted to be president and he didn't want his son to be with his name in the argument?
Well, that's not a bad guess, Brooke, really. He wanted something, not being president, but what did he want? He wanted something in return for his support. What do you think he got? A position, kind of a position in the cabinet. When he was elected president, Wilson appointed Franklin Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So that was Roosevelt's reward. So, Brooke, that was not bad. That was right on the same lines. He appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy as his reward for supporting him. Now, did Roosevelt ever run for the vice presidency? Come on now, don't let me down. He did. He ran with James M. Cox, remember? But who beat him? Warren Harding. So he had tried unsuccessfully for the vice presidency in 1920, ran with James Cox, which you should have in your notes, but they were defeated by Warren Harding. So let's back up a little bit. Not back up, but after this loss in 1920 when he ran for vice president, Roosevelt returned to private life, and his life changed on August 9th, 1921. His life would change forever on August 9th, 1921. And what happened on that date, his family had a summer home in Canada, and he fell into the water while he was sailing and became very chilled, very chilled. So on August 9, 1921, while he was at the family's summer home in Canada, he fell into the water while he was sailing and became very chilled. And the next day he felt incredibly tired. So he decided to go swimming to refresh himself, but when he finished, he went back to the house and he was just horribly tired, fatigued. More tired than he was before he tried to refresh himself by going for a swim. Well, by the next day, he noticed that neither of his legs were working properly. And by August 12th, he couldn't stand up or move his legs. So that was a tough week for him, and I'll kind of reiterate that again. It was on August 9th that he fell into the water while sailing at their summer home in Canada, became very chilled. Next day he was incredibly tired. He said, well, I'll take a swim to refresh myself. He finished, he went back, he was even more fatigued. The next morning, he noticed that neither of his legs were working properly, And by the next morning of August 12th, he couldn't stand up or move his legs at all. And he had severe pain, and his arms and hands were partially paralyzed. This all happened in the course of this week. So in addition to his not being able to stand up or move his legs, he suffered severe pain, and his arms and hands became partially paralyzed. So what did he do? Went to the doctor, and what did the doctor diagnose him with? Polio at the age of 39. Diagnosed him with polio at the age of 39.
So, was that, did the body incident give him polio, or was it just kind of the trigger? That
I think
he
it was the trigger, I think. You know, it was going to happen, probably. Well, what you have to do if you have polio is you got to really do a lot of grueling exercise and therapy to try to improve your condition, get your hands and legs working. And he did regain the use of his hands, and he developed great strength in his arms and shoulders, but he never did get any strength back, for the most part, in his legs. He would never again walk without help or the use of leg braces. So he worked really hard to try to improve his condition, and he did well with his hands and arms and shoulders, but his legs were never the same, and for the remainder of his life, he would never walk again without help or the use of leg braces. Well, despite this handicap, in 1928 he returned to politics, running for the governorship of New York. Ran for the governorship of New York in 1928, despite his health issues, and was successfully elected. So in 1928, Roosevelt returns to politics despite his health and was elected governor of New York. He was re-elected in 1930, and then by 1932 he had set his sights on what? The presidency. So that's how that accumulated. So in 1928, he's elected governor of New York. He's re-elected in 1930, and by 1932 he has his sights set on the presidency. Was he successful? He was elected President of the United States 4 times. 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944. 4 times. Only man in American history to be elected president 4 times. 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944. Well, on March 29th of 1945, on March 29th of 1945, Roosevelt left the White House for a little vacation, and he traveled to Warm Springs, Georgia, for a little R&R. So on March 29th, 1945, President Roosevelt left the White House, wanted to take a little vacation, and he traveled to Warm Springs, Georgia for a few days off. That was on March 29th. Stayed there for several days, and on April 12th, he was planning on attending a barbecue in the afternoon. He was planning on attending a barbecue in the afternoon of April 12, 1945.
Wait, in Georgia?
In Georgia, yeah. And he was working at his desk that morning, and he actually had an artist there that was painting his portrait while he was working at his desk that morning. And suddenly he whispered, "I have a terrible headache," and fell over in his chair. Just fell over. And he died a few hours later of what's called a cerebral hemorrhage while President of the United States. So on April 12, 1945, the President was planning to attend a barbecue that afternoon. He was working at his desk that morning while an artist painted his portrait, and all of a sudden he whispered, "I have a terrible headache," and fell over in his chair. He died a few hours later of a cerebral hemorrhage. That is what? Bleeding of the brain. We'll go into this a little bit later, but President Roosevelt was buried at Hyde Park, New York, where he rests today with his wife, Eleanor. A lot of things happened, though, between 1932 and 1945 that we'll tell you about. Now that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the 100 days. The 100 days.
Wait, he was born?
100 days. Anybody know what the 100 days is? Every president's still judged by that. I don't know exactly where I have it here, but there's a book over here. I gotta find it. There's one called A Thousand Days. It's written by Arthur Schlesinger about the Kennedy administration. So, Will, what did you say?
The stuff they do in the first 100 days.
Yeah, actually, it's what an administration does in the first 3 months, which is about 100 days. So presidents are kind of judged on how successful they're going to be by what they get done the first 3 months in office, which is termed historically as the 100 days. Usually you can predict what a president's going to be like during his term or terms by what he does in the first 3 months of his administration. Well, Roosevelt barely moved into the White House and he was getting after it. In the first 3 months of his administration, President Roosevelt helped pass 15 different pieces of legislation. That's just remarkable when you think of the process that goes through to pass a law through Congress. He passed 15 different pieces of legislation, got those passed during his first 3 months of his administration. Now what do you think every one of these laws was dealing with? Fixing the Great Depression. Yeah, fixing the Great Depression. So these new laws were to help fight every aspect of the Great Depression, and this period of time when the 15 laws were passed were called the 100 days. So from this point on, the first 3 months of a president's terms are referred to as 100 days. Roosevelt was the first one to be judged on what he got done the first 3 months in office. Okay? And like I mentioned, it's generally stated that the American